She'd mourned him for 5 years. 5 years of empty nights and a heart that beat around a hollow space where their bond used to burn. So when they dragged the dying wolf into her healing chamber at midnight, bleeding out on her ancient stone floor, and she recognized the scar on his collarbone, his scar, Alara didn't rush to save him. She stood there, healer's hands trembling not with urgency but with rage, and watched the man who'd let her believe he was dead struggle for each breath. Rowan Ashford, the Alpha Commander. Her fated mate who'd vanished without a word, leaving her to grieve a ghost. Everyone expected her to heal him. It was her duty, her gift, her oath. But Alara did the only thing that made sense at that moment. She turned her back on him. She didn't know that the dying Alpha at her feet had spent 5 years in exile protecting her from a blood curse. And she didn't care. Because tonight, the Omega who'd been broken by his abandonment wasn't going to save him. She was going to make him beg for forgiveness first. The candles in the palace healing chamber cast dancing shadows across ancient stone walls, creating an atmosphere that was equal parts sacred and suffocating. It was well past midnight, the hour when Alara Thorne did her best work. The palace slept, and in the silence, she could pretend the hollow ache in her chest was just exhaustion. She was bent over her workbench, grinding valerian root into powder, when the heavy oak doors burst open with a crash that sent glass vials rattling. Healer Thorne. Captain Aldrich's voice boomed through the chamber, destroying her carefully maintained peace. Emergency. We need you now. Alara didn't turn around. She continued grinding, the rhythmic motion of the pestle against mortar, a meditation she'd perfected over 5 years of forcing herself not to feel. Bring them to the examination table, she said, her voice professionally detached. I'll be there momentarily. The sound of struggle followed, boots scraping stone, men grunting with effort, the metallic smell of blood suddenly thick in the air. Too much blood. He's heavy as a damn boulder, one guard muttered. Don't drop him, you fool. If he dies, the queen will have our heads. Alara set down her pestle with deliberate care. She wiped her hands on her green healer's apron, the one that marked her as royal physician, a title she'd earned through skill, not birth. A title she'd buried herself in after. She didn't let herself finish that thought anymore. Turning, she moved toward the examination table with practiced efficiency, already cataloging supplies she might need. Severe blood loss meant hemlock tincture, honey salve, clean linens. Her mind was a fortress of protocol and procedure. It had to be. It was the only way she'd survived. Set him down gently, she instructed, approaching the table where 4 palace guards were lowering a massive form. What happened? Found him at the northern border, Captain Aldrich panted, stepping back. Ambushed by what looks like sorcerer marks. Claw wounds laced with dark magic. He's been bleeding for hours. Alara reached for the fallen warrior, her healer's instincts taking over before her mind could catch up. She pressed her fingers to his throat, searching for a pulse. His skin was cold, too cold, but there, faint and thready, a heartbeat struggled on. Get me hot water and my surgical kit, she commanded, her hands moving to assess the wounds beneath his blood-soaked clothing. And someone bring more candles. I need light too. Her fingers brushed against his collarbone, and she froze. There, hidden beneath torn fabric and dried blood, was a scar. Not from tonight's attack. This was old, silver with age. A crescent moon shape that she'd traced with her fingertips 1,000 times in another lifetime. No. The room tilted. The candles seemed to dim and flare simultaneously. Alara's breath caught in her throat as she jerked her hand back like she'd been burned. With trembling fingers, She reached for the cloth obscuring his face, pulling it away from features she'd seen every night in her dreams and nightmares for 5 years. Rowan Ashford stared up at her with half-closed eyes, golden and fading, fighting to focus through the haze of blood loss and pain. When they finally locked on her face, she saw recognition hit him like a physical blow. "Alara," he breathed, her name a broken prayer on his lips. The sound of her name in his voice, that voice she'd convinced herself she'd never hear again, shattered something inside her chest. Not the hollow place where their incomplete bond used to live. Something deeper. Something that had calcified into armor. It cracked, and what rushed in wasn't relief or joy or even the bittersweet ache of reunion. It was rage. Pure, white-hot, 5 years in the making fury. "Get out," Alara said quietly, not taking her eyes off Rowan's face. Captain Aldrich stepped closer. "My lady, he needs." "I said get out." The words tore from her throat with a force that made the guards stumble backward. The candles around the room flared, flames reaching toward the ceiling in a way that had nothing to do with natural air currents. The guards exchanged nervous glances. They'd never seen the calm, controlled healer lose her composure. Not once in 5 years. "But my lady," Aldrich tried again, "he's dying. Without your healing. Then let him die." Alara's voice was cold enough to frost the stone beneath their feet. "This man is nothing to me." She stepped back from the table, putting deliberate distance between herself and the male who'd destroyed her. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, the only thing keeping them from shaking. Or reaching for him. She couldn't tell which impulse was stronger. Rowan tried to speak, his lips forming words, but only a wet cough emerged, followed by blood. "Alara, please," he managed, the sound barely human. "Let me explain." "Explain?" The word came out like a laugh, jagged and wrong. "You want to explain?" "You had 5 years to explain, Rowan. 5 years while I mourned you. While I stood at your memorial stone and wept for a man who wasn't even dead." Her voice was rising now, all the professional control she'd cultivated crumbling like ash. The guards were backing toward the door, recognizing that they'd stumbled into something far more dangerous than a medical emergency. "You let me believe you died in the Great War," she continued, stalking closer to the table despite every instinct screaming at her to run. "I felt our bond go cold. I thought," her voice cracked, "I thought part of my soul died with you." Rowan's eyes were desperate, pleading, his hand reaching weakly toward her. "I had to," he rasped. "The curse, it would have killed you. I don't care about your reasons." Alara slammed her palm on the table beside his head, making him flinch, making the guards freeze at the door. "You made that choice for me. You decided my fate without giving me a voice. And now you have the audacity to come back, bleeding and broken, expecting me to what? Forgive you? Save you?" She leaned in close, close enough to see the flecks of amber in his golden eyes, close enough to smell the familiar scent of pine and storm that had haunted her for years. "I am a healer, Rowan Ashford," she whispered, her voice deadly calm now. "I have taken an oath to preserve life. But that oath has limits. And you." She straightened, looking down at him with something that might have been pity if it wasn't wrapped in so much anger. "You are already dead to me." She turned on her heel, green dress swirling around her ankles, and walked toward her workbench with measured steps. Behind her, Rowan's breathing grew more labored, more desperate. "My lady," Captain Aldrich said urgently, still hovering at the door. "Please. Whatever history you share, he came here seeking sanctuary. The Queen herself granted him safe passage. If he dies in your care, then the Queen can explain to the realm why her royal physician refused to heal a ghost, Alara said coldly, picking up her pestle and resuming her grinding as if there wasn't a dying man bleeding out 10 feet away. As if her hands weren't shaking so badly she could barely hold the tool steady. The chamber fell into heavy silence, broken only by the crackle of candle flames and Rowan's increasingly wet, struggling breaths. Alara closed her eyes, fighting the war raging inside her. The healer in her, trained since childhood to answer every call of suffering. The woman in her, still raw from a wound that had never properly healed. And something else, something deeper that stirred in her blood, responding to his presence despite 5 years of distance. The mate bond, dormant for so long she'd thought it dead, suddenly flickered to life. Not the gentle warmth she remembered. This was painful, like frostbitten fingers thrust into hot water. It burned through her veins, seeking its other half, screaming that he was here, he was real, and he was dying. Her hands stilled on the pestle. "Damn you," she whispered to the universe, to the moon goddess, to the fate that had brought him back into her life. "Damn you both." She set down her tools with exaggerated care and turned back to face the examination table. Rowan's eyes had closed. His chest barely moved. He'd stopped fighting, stopped trying to speak. Resigned to his fate, or perhaps simply too weak to protest anymore. Alara approached slowly, each step a battle against every instinct telling her to let him suffer as she had suffered. She stopped beside the table, looking down at the man who'd been her everything once. In the candlelight, she could see how the years had changed him. New scars. New lines around his eyes. He'd suffered too, she realized with grim satisfaction. "Good. Captain," she said without looking away from Rowan's face. "Bring me my surgical kit, the silver instruments, and fetch Elder Mora from her chambers. Tell her the royal physician requires her assistance with a critical patient." Relief flooded Aldrich's features. "Yes, my lady. Right away." As the guards scrambled to obey, Alara placed her hand over Rowan's heart, feeling the weak, irregular beat beneath her palm. "I'm going to heal you," she said quietly, for his ears alone if he could even still hear her. "Not because I forgive you. Not because I understand. But because I need you alive, Rowan Ashford." She leaned closer, her lips nearly brushing his ear. "I need you alive so you can explain every lie, every day, every moment of the 5 years you stole from me. And when you're done explaining," her hand pressed harder against his chest, the mate bond pulsing painfully between them, "then I'll decide if you deserve to keep breathing. But before we dive in, I need to ask you something that truly matters to me. If you've enjoyed my stories before, or if you're here hoping this one will move you, please don't leave without subscribing. Without your subscription, YouTube buries everything I create. The people searching for stories that make them feel something, stories about resilience, love, impossible choices, they'll never find them. Because the algorithm decided I wasn't worth showing. I'm not asking for money. Just 30 seconds to hit that subscribe button so others can discover these stories too. I pour everything I have into every word, every character, every chapter. And knowing I could reach someone who desperately needs it but won't because you didn't click, that genuinely breaks my heart. Please subscribe. It costs you nothing, but to me, it means someone believes these stories matter. Now, let's continue. 3 days of healing Rowan intense silence had brought Alara no closer to forgiveness, but it had brought back memories she'd spent 5 years trying to bury. The palace healing chamber had become a prison where past and present collided with brutal force, and tonight, as she ground herbs with mechanical precision, those memories finally broke through her carefully maintained walls. She'd been 18 when they first met. Not in a palace, not draped in the green robes of a royal physician, but in a dingy bar in Cold Creek, wearing a stained apron and keeping her head down while wolves far stronger than her decided her worth with every sneer and dismissive glance. The Iron Ridge bar had smelled of stale beer and fryer grease that night, the air thick with the musk of agitated shifters. Ilara, not yet a healer, just another Omega trying to survive, had wiped down the mahogany counter with hands red and chapped from harsh sanitizer, her wolf silent beneath her skin in a way that made the pack call her defective. She remembered Gareth's voice cutting through the din. "Hey, Runt. You missed a spot." She'd known that voice too well. Gareth Miller, the Beta's son, the man who according to ancient laws was supposed to be her fated mate. She'd felt the pull 3 months prior, that magnetic snap that told a wolf they'd found their other half. But Gareth had ignored it, spending 90 days pretending she didn't exist while making her life hell. "I'll get it right away, Gareth," she'd said, voice soft and empty of defiance. She'd learned that lesson the hard way. He sat in the corner booth with Tiffany draped across him, blonde, cruel, and everything Ilara wasn't. His entourage watched with predatory amusement as she approached. "Ilara," Gareth had said, standing to tower over her. The bar went silent. Glasses stopped clinking. Even the jukebox seemed to pause. "Since everyone is here, I thought it was time we cleared the air." Dread had coiled in her stomach like a serpent. "Don't," she'd whispered. "Please, Gareth. Not here." But he'd smiled, that empty, handsome smile. "I, Gareth Miller, future beta of the Iron Ridge Pack, hereby reject you, Ilara Thorne, as my mate." The words had hit like a physical blow. Rejection wasn't just a breakup for a wolf, it was a severing of the soul. Pain seared through her chest like a hot iron, and she'd gasped, clutching her apron as her knees buckled. Gareth hadn't offered a hand. He'd smirked instead. "I need a strong female by my side. Not a broken thing that can't even shift properly." Tiffany had giggled, nuzzling his neck. "Poor thing. Maybe you should leave town, Ilara. Go live with the humans. You're basically one of them anyway." The laughter that followed wasn't raucous. It was worse, dismissive. They weren't laughing because it was funny. They were laughing because she was pathetic. But as Ilara stood there, bleeding internally and metaphorically, something unexpected had happened. Looking at Gareth, really looking at him, she'd realized she didn't feel love. She felt relieved. The tether was cut. She was free. Accepted, she'd rasped. Gareth had blinked, his smile faltering. He'd wanted to beg. He'd wanted a show. Instead, Ilara had untied her apron, folded it neatly, and placed it on the table among the spilled beer. "I quit." She turned and walked out, the bell chiming cheerfully above her head, a stark contrast to the devastation she left behind. The Colorado winter had been unforgiving that night, wind howling down from the Rockies, carrying bite and snow. She hadn't stopped for her coat. She'd refused to go back inside. Hugging her thin uniform shirt around her body, she'd begun to walk. Not toward the Omega quarters. Toward the Treeline. The forbidden deadwoods where wolves were told never to venture. Where the pack dumped their secrets and handled business they didn't want the council to see. She'd needed the cold. Needed the numbness to freeze the burning hole in her chest where her bond used to be. She'd walked for over an hour, snow crunching under worn sneakers, the cold seeping into her bones. She'd thought about lying down in a snowbank and sleeping. It would have been peaceful. Then she smelled it. Copper, metallic, hot. Blood was so strong it made her gag. Against every survival instinct screaming at her to run, 18-year-old Ilara had slid down an embankment and found him in the clearing, a massive wolf, midnight black, lying in a pool of crimson. Steam rising from his body. Deep gashes along his flank that looked like they'd been made by silver claws. But it wasn't just any wolf. It was Rowan Ashford. And when their eyes met, her broken and hollow, his dying and desperate, something had snapped into place. Not the shallow pull she'd felt with Gareth. This was an anchor dropping into the deepest part of the ocean. Heavy. Ancient. Inevitable. "Hello," she'd whispered to the dying Alpha. His golden eyes had locked onto hers, and despite the growl rumbling in his chest, despite the warning to stay back or die, Alara had dropped to her knees in the snow. "You're dying," she'd stated simply. He'd tried to rise, lips curling back to reveal fangs the size of daggers, but his legs had given out. He'd collapsed with a huff of agony. And Alara, the rejected Omega with nothing left to lose, had crawled forward and pressed her hands against his wounds. "I've had a bad night too," she'd murmured. "So if you're going to bite me, make it quick." But he hadn't bitten her. Instead, something impossible had happened. As she'd sung an old lullaby her grandmother taught her, the only comfort she had left to give, a strange warmth had flooded from her hands into his wounds. The bleeding had slowed. The purple veins of poison had receded. She'd healed him without knowing she could heal at all. And when she'd woken hours later, alone with his coat wrapped around her and a medallion pressed into her palm, she'd known her life had changed forever. Now, 5 years later, Alara stood in her healing chamber watching that same Alpha breathe steadily in his sleep, his wounds mending under her reluctant care. The boy who'd rejected her had given her nothing but pain. But the wolf who'd accepted her salvation had given her a purpose she'd carried into everything she'd become. The question burning in her chest wasn't whether she could forgive Rowan for leaving. It was whether she could forgive herself for still wanting him despite everything. The memory of that night in the Deadwoods was always sharpest in the hours before dawn, when the palace slept and Alara kept vigil over patients who didn't know she was guarding them. Tonight, with Rowan unconscious on her examination table, the past refused to stay buried. She'd been numb with cold and heartbreak when she'd found him, her thin uniform shirt no match for the Colorado winter. The smell of blood had hit her first, copper and heat in the freezing air, so strong it made her stomach turn. Every instinct had screamed at her to run. A wounded animal was dangerous. A wounded Alpha was death. But Alara had been drawn to pain. She'd lived in it so long she recognized it like an old friend. She'd slid down the embankment, tearing her jeans on jagged roots, and landed hard in a clearing illuminated by moonlight reflecting off snow. There, lying in a pool of crimson that looked black in the darkness, was a wolf that made her breath catch. He was massive, easily twice the size of any pack wolf she'd known. Midnight black, fur matted with blood and mud. Deep gashes ran along his flank, edges shimmering with the telltale silver of poisoned claws. Steam rose from his body, and he wasn't moving. "Hello," she'd whispered, the word forming frost in the air between them. The massive head had snapped toward her, golden eyes locking onto hers with predatory focus. A low growl rumbled through the ground and into the soles of her worn sneakers. It was a warning. Stay back or die. But Alara had seen the wound on his neck, the artery nicked, pulsing sluggishly. "You're dying," she'd said simply. The wolf had tried to rise, lips curling back to reveal fangs like daggers, but his legs had given out. He'd collapsed with a huff that sounded almost human in its agony. She'd dropped to her knees in the snow, pulling out the only thing of value she possessed, a clean white cotton scarf meant to be returned to a customer. When she'd crawled forward, the wolf had snapped its jaws, the sound like a bear trap closing inches from her face. "Stop it," she'd scolded, her voice surprisingly steady. "If you bite me, you'll bleed out faster. Do you want to die here alone in the cold?" The wolf had frozen, intelligence sharpening in those golden eyes. He'd assessed her, seemed to recognize something, then huffed and went still, watching her warily. Ilara had pressed the scarf against the gashing wound on his neck. The heat radiating from him was immense, like touching a furnace. Blood had soaked through the white cotton instantly, warm and heavy. "I'm going to help you," she'd whispered. "Just stay with me." But the scarf hadn't been enough. The wound was too deep, and she'd realized with sinking horror that the claw marks on his flank were festering with wolf's bane. That was why he wasn't healing. Someone had hunted him with poison. She'd had nothing. No fire. No needle. No supplies. Just herself and a dying wolf in the shadow of death. Then she'd remembered her grandmother's words, spoken before the pack elders had exiled the old woman. "The voice of an Omega is not for commanding, child. It is for soothing. It is the hearthfire. It is the anchor." Ilara had never sung for anyone. In the Iron Ridge pack, noise from an Omega was considered disrespect. But out here, the rules didn't apply. She'd shifted, pulling the massive wolf's head into her lap. He'd tensed, a growl building, but blood loss had made him weak. He'd slumped against her thighs, his breathing hitching and wet. Ilara had begun to hum, a low vibration in her throat. Sleep now under the stars so bright, the hunter fades into the night. Her grandmother's lullaby had been raspy from cold but clear. And as the notes left her lips, something impossible had happened. The air around them had shimmered. The biting wind had died within their small circle. The wolf's eyes, which had been drifting shut in death, had snapped open, staring up at her with bewildered intensity. She'd continued singing, pouring everything into the song: Gareth's rejection, the bar's humiliation, the ache of being invisible. She'd given the song her sorrow, and in exchange, she'd felt something reaching back. A tether from the wolf that wasn't shallow or simple. It was an anchor dropping into the deepest part of the ocean. Heavy. Ancient. Rest your head, lay down your pain, until the sun rises again. She'd placed her hand over the wound on his flank, right over the wolf's bane infection. Energy had surged from her body, traveling down her arm, making her dizzy. Black spots had danced in her vision. Beneath her palm, the blackened flesh had hissed. The purple veins of poison had begun to recede. The bleeding at his neck had slowed, clotting unnaturally fast. The wolf had watched her, mesmerized, absorbing not just her healing but her essence, her scent of vanilla and rain, the cadence of her heartbeat, the weight of her grief. Ilara had sung until her voice cracked and her throat burned. When exhaustion finally claimed her, she'd slumped forward, her forehead resting against his thick, blood-matted fur. "Please live," she'd whispered into his ear. "Don't make me be the only one left." Then her world had gone black. She'd woken with a gasp, expecting snow and death. Instead, she'd been warm, lying on a bed of pine boughs and dry moss beneath a rock overhang. A small fire had crackled nearby, expertly built. She'd looked around frantically for the wolf, but the clearing had been empty save for the dark stain of blood in the snow. She'd been wearing a coat, heavy, tactical, expensive. It had smelled of pine, costly cologne, and him. In the pocket, her fingers had found something cold and hard, a platinum medallion embossed with a wolf's head crowned with thorns, howling at a fractured moon. The crest of the Obsidian Guard. The Alpha King's personal elite. Near the fire, scratched deep in the frozen earth, had been a single word: wait. Now, 5 years later, Alara understood what she hadn't then. She hadn't saved just any wolf that night. She'd saved Rowan Ashford, and in doing so, she'd bound herself to him in ways that went far deeper than any rejection could sever. The question was whether that binding had been salvation or curse. The memory shifted, growing sharper as Alara stared at Rowan's unconscious form. She remembered standing in that clearing, staring at the word "wait" scratched into frozen earth, her fingers tracing the platinum medallion that felt heavy with meaning she didn't yet understand. She hadn't had long to wonder. The snap of a twig had shattered the morning silence. Alara had spun around, clutching the oversized coat tighter, as 3 men emerged from the tree-line. They wore gray tactical gear that marked them as mercenaries, not pack wolves. They moved with lethal precision, weapons drawn, eyes scanning the clearing with professional efficiency. "There," one of them said, pointing a rifle at her. "The scent is all over her." "Is she the assassin?" the second man asked, his voice rough with suspicion. The first lowered his weapon slightly, studying her with cold calculation. "She's an Omega. Look at her. She couldn't kill a rabbit." Alara had backed toward the dying fire, her heart hammering against her ribs. These weren't Iron Ridge wolves. They were something far more dangerous. The third man stepped forward, huge, with a scar running down his nose that spoke of violence survived. "Girl," he demanded, "where is the man you were with?" I was alone," she stammered. "I found a wolf. Just a wolf." "A wolf?" The scarred man's eyes dropped to the coat she wore, and his expression transformed from suspicion to pure terror. He recognized it. The expensive leather. The tactical design. Whatever insignia it bore that she couldn't see. "We missed him," he hissed his companions. "He's mobile. And if he gave her his code." "We have to go," the first man interrupted urgently. "If the king is alive and mobile, the royal guard will be swarming this sector within the hour. If they find us here." "What about the girl?" the second man asked, pulling a knife from his belt. She saw him. "She knows too much. No loose ends." The scarred man looked at Alara with something like pity mixed with pragmatism. He raised his blade. Then a howl tore through the forest. It wasn't a normal howl. It was a sound that made the trees shake, that vibrated in the marrow of Alara's bones. It was a command, a declaration of war, a promise of violence so absolute that even she had felt her knees weaken. The 3 mercenaries froze, faces draining of color. "The king," the scarred man whispered. They didn't hesitate. They turned and ran, abandoning their mission, fleeing the sound of the apex predator who'd just announced his survival. Alara stood alone in the clearing, the fire crackling, that howl still echoing in her chest. She realized then that the wolf she'd saved wasn't just powerful. He was a king. The Alpha King, if the mercenaries were to be believed. She looked down at the coat, his coat, and made a decision. Turning it inside out to hide the expensive leather, she folded it carefully and began the long walk back to Cold Creek. Every shadow looked like a threat. Every sound made her flinch. But she made it to the Omega quarters as dawn bled gray over the horizon. In the privacy of her tiny room, she hid the coat under a loose floorboard, placing the medallion on top. Evidence of a night that had changed everything, though she didn't understand how much. She scrubbed the blood from her hands until her skin was raw, tried to wash the scent of pine and power from her body. But it clung to her like a brand, marking her as his in ways the pack couldn't see but would eventually sense. The word "wait" haunted her for days. Wait for what? Wait for him to return? Wait for an explanation that might never come? She waited. And 5 years later, he'd finally come back, not as the king she'd imagined, but as a dying man who'd let her believe he was dead all that time. Now, standing in her healing chamber with Rowan unconscious on the table, Alara understood the cruelty of that single word scratched in the dirt. He'd asked her to wait without telling her what she was waiting for, without giving her a choice, without considering that waiting could break a person just as thoroughly as abandonment. He'd asked her to wait, and she had. But her patience had long since turned to ash. The sound of Rowan's breathing changing pulled Alara from the memory. His chest rose and fell more steadily now, the worst of the poison finally purged. She should have felt relief. Instead, she felt the same dread that had gripped her 5 years ago when she'd returned to Cold Creek and discovered what was coming. She'd made it back to her room at the Omega quarters just as the emergency bells began ringing through the Pack territory. By noon, the atmosphere in Cold Creek had shifted from sleepy isolation to frantic terror. Alara had been summoned to the main Pack house, not to serve drinks this time, but to clean. The humiliation had felt almost quaint compared to what she'd survived the night before. When she'd arrived, the mansion had been in chaos. Betas scrubbing floors, Gammas painting over cracked walls, Alpha Silas pacing the foyer, his face a mask of purple rage that made the servants flinch with each footfall. "I want this place spotless," Silas had roared, backhanding a young servant who'd dropped a vase. "If I see a speck of dust, I'll strip the skin off your backs." Alara had kept her head down, grabbed a bucket and rag, and tried to blend into the woodwork at the base of the stairs. But Gareth had spotted her. Well, look who crawled back. He'd sneered from the top of the staircase, Tiffany beside him in a dress that cost more than Alara made in a year. "I thought you quit. I thought you were going to run away." "The buses aren't running," Alara had said quietly, scrubbing at a stain on the carpet. It had been a lie. The buses were running, but Alpha Silas had locked down the territory borders that morning. No one in, no one out. Gareth had kicked her bucket, sending dirty water soaking across her jeans and the carpet she'd just cleaned. "Oops. Clean it up, runt. And do it fast. You know who's coming, don't you?" Alara's blood had run cold. She'd frantically tried to soak up the water before Silas saw, her hands shaking. "The crown," Gareth had whispered, leaning down so his breath hit her ear. "King Lachlan Blackwood. He's doing a surprise inspection of the Northern Territories." The name had hit her like a physical blow. Blackwood. The king. The man known as the Wolf of Death, who'd united warring factions by slaughtering every alpha who refused to kneel. The man whose coat was currently hidden under her floorboards. The wolf in the woods had been him. "Why is he coming?" Alara had managed, her voice trembling. "To congratulate me, obviously," Gareth had preened, adjusting his cufflinks. "My father and I have secured the northern trade routes. He's coming to honor the Iron Ridge Pack." Tiffany had giggled. "And maybe he's looking for a queen. Though I hear he's heartless. They say he killed his last mate because she was weak." It had been a rumor, but looking at the fear in every Pack member's eyes, it was a rumor they believed. A sudden, terrible thought had struck Alara as she knelt in that puddle. The mercenaries in the woods had been hunting the king. They'd been using wolf's bane, a poison that didn't grow naturally in Cold Creek. It had to be imported, and the only person with funds and clearance to import rare botanical poisons was Alpha Silas. The realization had hit her like a punch to the gut. The Iron Ridge Pack hadn't just ignored the king's injury. They had orchestrated it. Gareth and his father were trying to assassinate the Alpha King. And now the king was coming to dinner. Alara had stayed frozen on her knees, her mind racing. The king had survived. He'd given her his coat, left her that medallion, told her to wait. But he didn't know that the pack preparing to honor him was the same pack that had tried to murder him. She'd looked up at Gareth, seeing him with new eyes. The smug confidence. The expensive suit. The way he kept glancing at his father with barely concealed excitement. They thought they'd succeeded. They thought the king coming here was their victory, not knowing he'd survived their ambush. "Stay out of sight tonight," Gareth had said, walking away. "If the king sees an unshifted Omega like you, he might think we're breeding runts. It would be embarrassing." But Elara had known the truth. They wanted her hidden because an Omega who'd been in the Deadwoods the night of the assassination was a liability. If the king questioned the wrong person, their entire conspiracy would unravel. She'd spent the rest of that day in a haze of terror and impossible choices. She could warn the king, but how? She was nobody, and Omega the pack would silence the moment she opened her mouth. She could run, but the borders were locked, and where would she go? She could stay silent, but then she'd be complicit in treason and murder. By evening, as the pack house transformed into a showcase of false loyalty, Elara had made her decision. She would wait, as he'd asked. She would watch. And if the king recognized her, if their eyes met across that banquet hall, she would find a way to tell him the truth, even if it killed her. Now, 5 years later, Elara understood that night had been the beginning of everything. The moment when she'd stopped being a victim and started being a player in a game far more dangerous than she'd imagined. The night she'd chosen to save a king a second time, not with her voice, but with her silence and her vigilance. The night she'd started becoming the woman who now stood over his unconscious body, still deciding whether he deserved her forgiveness. The arrival of the royal convoy that evening had been an earthquake. 10 black SUVs had torn into the gravel driveway, and 50 members of the Obsidian Guard had poured out, lethal efficiency personified, dressed in black tactical gear, faces covered. Moving with synchronicity that had terrified the ragtag warriors of Iron Ridge Pack. Elara had been watching from the narrow window of the kitchen pantry where she'd been ordered to stay and polish silver, hidden away from important guests. She'd watched as the back door of the lead vehicle opened, and the world had seemed to slow down. A boot hit the gravel. Then a man rose. Rowan Ashford, though she hadn't known his name then, had been taller than she remembered. In the woods, curled up and dying, he'd seemed massive. Standing upright, he'd been a titan. He radiated power, a physical pressure that made the air heavy. He hadn't looked at the bowing Alpha Silas or at Gareth trying desperately to look important. He'd scanned the house, nostrils flaring slightly, searching. Elara had ducked below the windowsill, her heart racing. "He's looking for me." The kitchen door had banged open. Martha, the head Omega, had thrust a heavy silver tray into Elara's hands. "Stop hiding." 2 servers fainted from the alpha pressure. "You need to take the wine out." "I can't," Elara had whispered, panic rising. Silas said. "Silas wants wine on the table now," Martha had hissed. "Keep your head down. Don't speak. Get in and out." Elara had no choice. The dining room had been silent when she entered. Usually packed dinners were raucous affairs, but tonight you could hear a pin drop. The long table was set with the finest china. Alpha Silas sat at one end, sweating profusely. Gareth and Tiffany near him, wearing forced smiles. At the head sat the king. Rowan hadn't been eating. He'd sat perfectly still, golden eyes boring into Silas. His commander stood directly behind him, hand resting on a blade hilt. An honor, truly, Silas had been babbling, voice pitching high with nerves. "We've ensured the northern borders are secure. No rogues, no threats." "Is that so?" Rowan had asked, his voice soft but carrying to every corner. Then explain to me, Silas, why I found traces of a struggle in the deadwoods 3 miles from here. Silas had dropped his fork. It clattered loudly against china. A struggle? Just poachers, surely. We handle them. Poachers? Rowan had tasted the word. Deer poachers use military-grade wolfsbane? The color had drained from Gareth's face as he'd looked at his father. Alara had moved silently around the table, filling glasses, making herself small. She'd started at the far end, working toward the king. Her hands had been shaking so badly the bottle rattled against glass rims. "We don't know anything about that, Your Majesty," Gareth had interjected, trying to sound brave. "We are loyal subjects." Rowan had turned his gaze to Gareth, and Alara had seen something predatory flash in those golden eyes. "And who are you?" "Gareth Miller. Future Beta." Gareth had beamed, gesturing to Tiffany. "This is my chosen mate. She is of strong bloodline." "Chosen?" Rowan had said. "Not fated." Gareth had laughed nervously. "Fate is an old superstition, isn't it? I rejected my fated mate. She was unsuitable, a defect. An omega without a wolf." Rowan's fingers had tightened on his wine glass stem. The glass cracked audibly. "You rejected your fated mate because she was weak," Rowan had repeated, voice dropping to something dangerous. "She was nothing," Gareth had said dismissively, emboldened by the king's attention. "Practically human. Useless to the pack." Alara had been 3 chairs away. She'd frozen, feeling the king's anger spiking, the air growing hot and suffocating. "I see," Rowan had said darkly. "In my experience, strength is not always fangs and claws. Sometimes it is the will to survive when everyone wants you dead." Alara had stepped forward to refill the glass of the man beside the king. Her hand shook. The bottle rattled. The commander had looked up annoyed. "Steady, girl." "Sorry," Alara had gasped softly. One word. A whisper. But Rowan had frozen. His head had snapped toward her so fast it was a blur. Alara had kept her head down, hair falling like a curtain over her face. She'd backed away, clutching the tray. Rowan had stood up. The chair scraped loudly. "You," he commanded. The entire room had gone dead silent. "Your Majesty," Silas had stammered. "Forgive her. She's the runt. She's clumsy. I'll have her removed." "Silence," Rowan had roared, cracking plaster on the ceiling. He'd walked around the table like a predator stalking prey. He'd stopped in front of Alara, trembling so hard the wine bottle rattled against the tray. She'd stared at his polished shoes. "Look at me," he'd ordered, voice urgent now, not angry. Alara had slowly lifted her chin. She'd met his eyes. The molten gold had burned into her. Rowan had inhaled, smelling cheap detergent, fear, onions, and underneath, faint but undeniable, vanilla and rain. "It's you," he'd breathed. Gareth had stood, confused and jealous. "Your Majesty, don't waste time with her. That's the reject I told you about. She's nobody." Rowan hadn't broken eye contact with Alara. He'd reached into his pocket and pulled out a white cotton scarf, stained brown with old blood. "You left this," Rowan had said softly, holding it between them like an offering. Alara's breath had hitched. I needed to stop the bleeding. You sang to me." Rowan had taken a step closer, wrapping her in his scent. "Why did you run?" "Because I'm a defect," Alara had whispered, tears pricking her eyes. "Because if they knew I helped you, they would kill me." Rowan's eyes had darkened to pitch black. "Who would dare touch her?" he demanded, spinning to face the room. And then he'd lifted his hand and brushed a stray lock of hair behind her ear. A spark, visible, blue, electric, had arced between their skin. The mate bond undeniable. Rowan had grabbed her hand and pulled her against his chest. Gareth Miller, he'd said without looking away from Alara. You rejected her? I did, Gareth had stammered. Good, Rowan had said, lowering his head so his lips brushed Alara's ear. Because that means she's mine. The silence in the banquet hall had been absolute, a vacuum sucking the air from the room, leaving only the thunderous sound of heartbeats. Rowan had held Alara against his chest, his hand splayed protectively over her back. To everyone else, he'd been a statue of terrifying composure. But Alara had felt the vibrations of a low, rumbling growl emanating from his chest, a possessive purr, a promise of violence against anyone who tried to take her. Yours. Gareth had choked out, his face a mottled canvas of red rage and white shock. You can't be serious. She's a servant. She's a broken Omega. She is my savior, Rowan had corrected, his voice like grinding stones. And she is my mate. A collective gasp had swept through the room. The concept had been impossible to them, the Alpha King, the most powerful wolf on the continent, paired with the pack's punching bag. It defied every law of hierarchy they worshipped. Tiffany had stood up, her chair screeching. This is a trick, she'd shrieked, poise shattering. She bewitched you. She uses dark magic. Everyone knows the Thorns were involved in witchcraft before they died. Sit down, Rowan's commander had barked, stepping forward with his hand on his weapon. But Alpha Silas had seen an opening. Desperate, cornered, he'd stood up, wiping sweat from his forehead. Your Majesty, please listen to reason. The girl isn't well. She has delusions. We keep her working to give her purpose. She's a pathological liar. She likely found you in the woods and compromised you while you were injured. She poisoned you. Alara had stiffened in Rowan's arms. I didn't, she'd whispered. Rowan had looked down at her. Speak up, he'd murmured gently. Do not whisper. You have the king's ear now. Let them hear you. Alara had looked at the crowd, the faces of people who'd tormented her for years. She'd taken a shaky breath and remembered the melody she'd sung in the woods. Strength isn't always claws. I didn't poison him, Alara had said, voice trembling but clear. I found him dying in the deadwoods. His neck was slashed. He'd been injected with wolf's bane. She'd turned her gaze to Silas. The same wolf's bane I saw crates of in the basement last week. The crates marked medical supplies that Gareth told me never to touch. The room had erupted. Liar! Gareth had shouted, lunging forward. Rowan hadn't moved his feet. He'd simply raised his free hand and backhanded the air. A wave of pure kinetic force, Alpha Command, had slammed into Gareth, lifting him off his feet and throwing him backward into the wall. He'd crumpled to the floor, groaning. The basement, Rowan had repeated, his eyes locking onto Silas. Commander, take a squad. Check the basement. No, Silas had screamed. You have no right. This is my territory. Your territory? Rowan had laughed, cold and humorless. I am the king. Every inch of soil, every drop of water, and every breath you take belongs to me. And you have used my land to plot my murder. Rowan's commander had signaled to two guards who'd immediately headed for the kitchen door leading to the lower levels. Silas had looked around frantically, his eyes meeting those of a pack guard standing by the main entrance, the scarred mercenary Alara had seen in the woods, now disguised among the staff. Alara had seen the look. She'd seen the nod. Rowan, she'd screamed, gripping his lapels. Look out. The warning had come a second too late. Windows had shattered inward as canisters were thrown from the darkness outside. They'd hit the floor and hissed, spewing thick gray smoke. Tear gas, the commander had shouted. Protect the king. Chaos had descended. The Iron Ridge elite, realizing their alpha had just declared war on the crown, had drawn hidden weapons. The dinner hadn't been a stalling tactic, it had been an ambush. "Kill them all," Silas had roared, flipping the table. China had shattered, sending shards flying like shrapnel. "Leave no witnesses." Rowan had moved with inhuman speed, sweeping Alara behind him, shielding her body with his own. He'd grabbed a silver steak knife from the table and thrown it. It had flown through the smoke and pinned a rushing attacker's hand to the wall. "Stay close to me," Rowan had ordered Alara, his voice calm amidst the screaming. "Do not let go of my jacket." "Your coat," she'd corrected instinctively, adrenaline flooding her system. "I hid your coat." Rowan had looked back at her, a fierce grin cutting through the smoke. "Good girl." The room had become a blur of violence. The Obsidian Guard were outnumbered but elite, moving in phalanx formation, cutting down traitorous pack wolves. But Silas had prepared well. More mercenaries, human ones armed with silver bullet assault rifles, had poured in from the servants' entrance. Gunfire had erupted, deafening cracks echoing off high ceilings. Rowan had roared, a sound that shook the chandeliers. He hadn't shifted fully, but his claws had extended 6 inches of razor-sharp bone. He'd torn through attackers, a whirlwind of death. But in the confusion, the smoke had grown thicker. Alara had coughed, her eyes streaming. She'd lost sight of Rowan's back for a split second as a mercenary lunged at him with a stun baton. A hand had grabbed her arm, painful, fingers digging into her bicep. "Got you, you little rat," Gareth's voice had hissed in her ear. Alara had screamed, but the sound was swallowed by gunfire. Gareth had yanked her backward, dragging her away from the center of the room toward the service corridor. "Rowan," she'd cried out. Rowan had heard her. He'd spun around, snapping a mercenary's neck. He'd seen Alara's foot disappear through the swinging kitchen doors. "Alara." He'd tried to follow, but 3 massive enforcers, injected with some kind of steroid rage serum, had tackled him simultaneously. Rowan had snarled, the beast taking over. He would kill them all. He would burn this house to the ground. But first, he had to get free. Gareth hadn't stopped in the kitchen. He dragged Alara down the narrow concrete stairs that led to the sublevel, the old meat lockers where the pack stored supplies and handled their darker business. Alara had fought him, clawing at his face, kicking his shins, biting his hand until she tasted blood. "Let me go," she'd shrieked. Gareth had backhanded her. The blow had sent her spinning into the cold metal shelves of the storage area. She'd tasted copper, her lip split open. "Shut up," Gareth had panted, slamming the heavy steel door shut and throwing the bolt. The sounds of battle above had become muffled, a distant thumping. He turned to her, his face bleeding from where she'd scratched him, his expensive suit torn, eyes wild with panic and madness. "You ruined everything," he'd spat, pacing the small freezing room. "We were so close. Silas promised me. He promised I would be governor of the North once the king was dead. And you had to save him." Alara had wiped blood from her lip, forcing herself to stand. Her legs had been shaking, but she'd kept her chin high. She wasn't the cowering girl from the bar anymore. She'd held the king of alphas. She'd felt his power. "He will come for me," Alara had said calmly. "And when he does, there will be nothing left of you to bury." Gareth had laughed, high and hysterical. He'd reached into a crate on the shelf, one marked medical supplies, and pulled out a syringe filled with glowing purple liquid. "Wolf's Bane concentrate. He won't find you in time," Gareth had sneered, advancing with the needle. "Or maybe I'll make a trade. The king's life for his mates." "Why?" Alara had asked, stepping back until her spine hit the freezing wall. Why do you hate me so much, Gareth? Is it just because I have no wolf? Because I'm weak. Gareth had stopped. He'd looked at her with genuine pity mixed with disgust. You stupid girl, he'd whispered. You still don't know, do you? You don't have a wolf because we killed it. Alara had frozen. The air had left her lungs. What? Your parents didn't die in a car accident, Gareth had confessed, enjoying the horror on her face. They were strong. Too strong. Your father challenged Silas for the alpha position 20 years ago. He almost won. He'd taken another step closer. Silas couldn't let that bloodline continue. He killed them. But he couldn't kill a pup without the council investigating. So he took you in and ordered the pack doctor to dose you with suppressants every month. Put it in your school lunch. Put it in your water. Alara's mind had reeled. The memories, constant sickness as a child, the strange bitter taste in the orphanage water, the way she'd felt feverish before every full moon but never shifted. My wolf, she'd whispered, clutching her stomach. She isn't dead. She's buried, Gareth had smirked. Buried under years of chemical suppression. You aren't a defect, Alara. You're a threat. An alpha female waiting to happen. That's why I rejected you. I couldn't risk mating with you and breaking the suppression. Silas would have killed me. He'd raised the syringe. But now it doesn't matter. This dose will finish what we started. He'd lunged. Alara hadn't screamed. A cold rage, older than the mountains, had flooded her veins. It wasn't the king's power this time. It was hers. She ducked under Gareth's arm, grabbing a heavy glass jar of pickled beets from the shelf. She'd swung it with all her might. Crash! The jar had shattered against Gareth's head. Vinegar and red juice had exploded everywhere, looking like blood. Gareth had howled, dropping the syringe, stumbling back, blinded by the juice in his eyes. Alara had scrambled for the syringe, her fingers closing around it. Gareth had wiped his eyes and roared, shifting. His face had elongated, for sprouting, teeth lengthening. He'd been going to kill her in wolf form. He'd leaped at her. Alara hadn't run. She'd dropped to her knees, sliding across the slick floor, going under his leap. As he'd passed over her, she'd stabbed the syringe upward, not knowing where it hit, just pushing the plunger. Gareth had landed on all fours, snarling. He'd turned to rip her throat out. Then he'd frozen. A whimper had escaped his throat. The purple liquid had been instantaneous, a concentrated dose meant for a king coursing through the veins of a beta. Gareth had convulsed, collapsed onto his side, foaming at the mouth, his transformation reversing grotesquely. Alara had scrambled back, panting, watching the boy she'd once thought she loved writhe on the floor. You rejected me, she'd whispered to his convulsing form. And I reject your death. She hadn't wanted his blood on her hands. She'd wanted justice. The heavy steel door had buckled. Boom. Someone hitting it from outside. Boom. The metal had warped. Boom. The door had flown off its hinges, clattering across the floor. Rowan had stood in the doorway, covered in blood, none of it his own. His shirt had been in ribbons, revealing intricate tattoos across his chest. His eyes had been burning gold. He'd seen Gareth on the floor. He'd seen Alara huddled in the corner, covered in beet juice and glass. He'd been across the room in a heartbeat, dropping to his knees, his hands hovering over her, afraid to touch in case she was broken. Alara, he'd choked out. Did he? I'm okay, she'd whispered, the adrenaline fading, leaving her shaking. It's just beets. And his blood. Rowan had looked at Gareth, unconscious, breathing shallow. He'd sniffed the air. Wolf's bane. He tried to use it on me, Alara had said. He told me everything, Rowan. My parents. My wolf. They drugged me for years. A low, terrifying sound had built in Rowan's throat, the sound of a king who'd just found a reason to burn the world down. Rowan had scooped Alara up into his arms as if she weighed nothing, holding her tight, burying his face in her neck, inhaling her scent to ground himself. The beast in him had wanted blood, wanted to tear Gareth apart piece by piece, but the man in him needed to know she was safe first. It's over, he'd promised her, his voice rough with barely contained violence. I have the pack. Silas is in chains. And this one, he looked at Gareth's unconscious form with pure contempt. He will live long enough to confess to the council. He'd carried her up the stairs, stepping over debris and bodies. The banquet hall had been a war zone, mercenaries dead or captured, the obsidian guard securing the perimeter. Silas had been on his knees, silver chains binding his wrists, face bloodied and broken. But Alara had barely registered any of it. She'd been trembling in Rowan's arms, not from fear but from something else. Something building inside her chest. A pressure. A presence that had been dormant for so long she'd forgotten it was there. Where are we going? She'd asked, resting her head on his shoulder. Home, Rowan had said, carrying her toward the convoy of black SUVs. To the Obsidian Palace. You need a healer and you need to wake up. Wake up. Your wolf, Rowan had said, his golden eyes meeting hers as they stepped into the cold night air. Snow had been falling softly on the carnage. She isn't dead, Alara. I can feel her. She's clawing at the surface. And when she wakes up... He'd paused at the door of the lead vehicle, looking down at her with something like reverence. She's going to be magnificent. But Alara had stopped listening. Because in that moment, as Rowan had spoken those words, something inside her had snapped. Not broken, released. Like a dam bursting after years of pressure. The suppressants. 20 years of poison in her system, keeping her wolf buried, keeping her weak and controllable. But she'd used so much energy healing Rowan in the woods. She'd poured her essence into him, and in doing so, she'd burned through layers of the chemical cage. And then she'd done it again tonight, the rage, the fear, the desperate fight for survival. Each emotion had been fuel, burning away the suppressants faster than her body could absorb new doses. Her wolf wasn't just waking up. She was erupting. Rowan, Alara had gasped, her body suddenly burning from the inside out. Something's wrong. He looked down at her, his expression shifting from concern to recognition to something close to awe. No, he'd breathed. Something's right. Alara's back had arched. Pain, white-hot and all-consuming, had torn through her spine. She'd screamed, the sound echoing across the clearing, making wolves from both sides stop and turn. Rowan had set her down gently on the snow-covered ground, kneeling beside her, his hands hovering, not restraining but supporting. Don't fight it, he commanded, his voice dropping into that alpha timbre that made every cell in her body want to obey. Let her out, Alara. Let her come home. But there had been a problem. A complication that neither of them had anticipated. The wolf trying to emerge wasn't just any wolf. She was an alpha female, the rarest and most powerful bloodline. And she'd been suppressed for 2 decades, compressed and caged and starved. When she finally broke free, the force of it would be like a nuclear explosion. Alara's bones had begun to crack and reform. Fur had started sprouting along her arms. Her teeth had elongated, her vision sharpening until she could see every snowflake, every blood cell, every particle of violence that lingered in the air. And then she'd felt it. The thing Rowan hadn't told her. The secret he'd kept, The reason he'd disappeared 5 years ago. The blood curse. It had been there all along, dormant in his veins, passed down through his bloodline like a hereditary disease. Any Omega who bonded with an Ashford Alpha would die within a year, their life force slowly drained to feed the curse. His mother had died screaming. His grandmother before her. Every generation, the same tragedy. He'd faked his death to save her from that fate. But what Rowan hadn't known, what no one had known, was that Alara wasn't just any Omega. She was a sanctuary bloodline, descended from the ancient healers who'd originally blessed the wolf packs. Her grandmother had been exiled for possessing too much power, for refusing to be weaponized by the council. The curse couldn't kill her, because her bloodline had created the original blessings and could unmake any curse. But first, she had to survive her own awakening. Alara had looked up at Rowan through eyes that were shifting between human green and wolf gold. "You left me," she'd gasped between waves of pain, "because of a curse." Rowan's face had been anguished. "I couldn't watch you die. I couldn't." "You should have asked me," Alara had snarled, her voice deepening, taking on the resonance of her wolf. "You should have let me choose." And then the final barrier had shattered. Alara's heart had stopped. For 3 full minutes, she'd been clinically dead, her body seizing, her eyes rolling back. Rowan had roared her name, gathering her against his chest, his own heart breaking as he felt the mate bond flickering, dying. The Obsidian Guard had rushed forward. Silas, even in chains, had started laughing a mad, broken sound. The curse, he'd cackled. The Ashford curse finally got its due. But then Alara's eyes had snapped open. They weren't green anymore. They weren't even gold. They were silver. Pure, luminous silver. And when she'd taken her first breath, power had exploded from her body in a visible wave, golden light that swept across the clearing, making every wolf drop to their knees, forcing even Rowan's commander to bow. Alara had risen from Rowan's arms, standing on shaking legs, and she'd felt it. The curse in Rowan's blood, ancient and malicious, trying to latch onto her, trying to drain her life force. She'd grabbed it with her will and crushed it. The curse had shattered like glass, the fragments dissolving into nothing, purged from the Ashford bloodline after centuries of suffering. Rowan had stared at her, blood tears tracking down his face, the sign of a mate bond completed, a curse broken, a future suddenly possible. "What are you?" he'd whispered. Alara had looked down at her hands, at the silver light still dancing across her skin, at the wolf inside her finally free and magnificent. "I'm what they tried to kill," she'd said, her voice carrying across the clearing. "I'm what they tried to bury. I'm the sanctuary Omega who breaks curses and crowns kings." She looked at Rowan, at the man who'd tried to protect her by leaving, who'd suffered alone for 5 years under the weight of an impossible choice. "And I'm angry that you didn't trust me to save you the way you saved me." The silence that followed Alara's words was deafening. Rowan stood before her in the snow, the king of alphas brought to his knees not by an enemy but by the truth in her silver eyes. Around them, the Obsidian Guard remained bowed, instinctively recognizing power that transcended rank and hierarchy. "Alara," Rowan began, his voice raw with emotion, "I was trying to protect." "No," she cut him off, her voice sharp as a blade. The silver light around her flared brighter. "You were trying to control. You made the choice for me, Rowan. You decided my fate without giving me a voice. Just like Silas decided for my parents. Just like Gareth decided I was worthless. Just like this entire pack decided I should be nothing." She took a step toward him, and despite being the most powerful alpha on the continent, Rowan took a step back. I spent 5 years mourning you, Alara continued, her anger finally unleashed after days of suppression. 5 years believing our bond had died. 5 years building a life from the ashes you left me in. And you knew. You knew I was alive, and you stayed away. The curse would have killed you, Rowan protested, his hands reaching for her but not quite touching. I watched my mother die, Alara. I watched the curse drain her until there was nothing left but a husk. I wouldn't do that to you. But you'd let me think you were dead? Alara's voice broke, the anger cracking to reveal the grief beneath. You'd let me stand at your memorial stone and weep? You'd let me believe I'd lost the only person who'd ever seen me as more than broken. Rowan's face contorted with anguish. I thought it was kinder than watching you die slowly. Kinder? Alara laughed, bitter and sharp. There's nothing kind about being left behind, Rowan. Nothing kind about being denied the truth. Nothing kind about stealing someone's choice because you think you know better. She turned away from him, looking at the assembled wolves, the Obsidian Guard, the captured Iron Ridge traders, even Silas still in chains, watching this confrontation with predatory interest. Do you know what I learned tonight? Alara asked, addressing them all. I learned that I was never weak. I was drugged, poisoned, systematically suppressed because the men in power were afraid of what I might become. She looked back at Rowan. And I learned that the man I loved 5 years ago was just as afraid. Afraid to trust me. Afraid to believe I could be strong enough to survive whatever came. That's not fair, Rowan said quietly. You didn't know about the curse. You didn't know what it would do. And whose fault is that? Alara demanded. You never told me. You felt the mate bond forming and you ran. You made assumptions about my strength, my resilience, my ability to fight. Just like everyone else in my life, you underestimated me. Rowan stood there, the mighty king reduced to a man being dissected by the truth. Around them, snow continued to fall, nature indifferent to the drama of wolves and their broken bonds. You're right, Rowan finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. You're absolutely right. I was a coward. I was so terrified of losing you the way my father lost my mother that I lost you anyway. He took a breath, steadying himself. But I'm here now, Alara. I'm here, and I'm asking, begging for a chance to prove that I can be the mate you deserve. Not the one who decides for you, but the one who stands beside you while you decide for yourself. Alara felt the mate bond pulling at her, urging her toward him, whispering that he was hers and she was his and nothing else mattered. But she'd spent 5 years learning to ignore that pull, building walls around her heart, becoming someone who didn't need anyone. The question was whether she wanted to tear those walls down. If I accept this bond, Alara said slowly, each word measured and deliberate, it won't be on your terms, Rowan Ashford. It won't be you claiming me as yours, sweeping in to rescue the poor broken Omega and make her a queen. She walked toward him, closing the distance until they stood chest to chest, her silver eyes boring into his gold. If I accept this bond, you kneel first. You acknowledge what you took from me. You acknowledge that I am your equal, not your protected weakness. You acknowledge that I saved your life not once but twice, and that without me, your bloodline would still be cursed. The assembled wolves gasped. No one demanded the Alpha King kneel. It was unthinkable. It was blasphemy. But Rowan looked at Alara, really looked at her, at the woman who'd sung to a dying wolf when anyone else would have run, who'd endured 20 years of suppression and still had the strength to break free, who'd just shattered a centuries-old curse with the sheer force of her will, and he understood. This wasn't about dominance. It wasn't about pack hierarchy or ancient traditions. This was about respect, about partnership, about two people choosing each other as equals. Slowly, deliberately, Rowan Ashford, king of alphas, dropped to one knee in the blood-stained snow. The world seemed to hold its breath. Every wolf in the clearing, guard and traitor alike, stared in disbelief at their king kneeling before the Omega who'd been nobody just hours before. The snow fell in silence, each flake a witness to something unprecedented, something that would be whispered about in pack histories for generations to come. Rowan looked up at Alara, golden eyes meeting silver, and spoke words that carried across the frozen clearing with the weight of an oath. I kneel before the woman who saved my life when she had every reason to let me die. I kneel before the healer who broke a curse my bloodline has suffered for centuries. I kneel before the Omega who endured 20 years of suppression and emerged not broken, but magnificent. His voice grew stronger, resonant with power and genuine humility. I kneel because you are not my possession to claim, Alara Thorne. You are my equal, my partner, my salvation. He reached up, offering his hand, not demanding, but asking. I kneel because I was wrong. Wrong to leave. Wrong to decide for you. Wrong to underestimate the strength it takes to survive what you've survived and still choose compassion over cruelty. Alara looked down at him, this powerful alpha humbling himself before her, and felt something shift in her chest. The anger didn't disappear. It would take time to heal that wound, but beneath it, she felt something else. Choice. Agency. Power. She took his hand. The moment their skin touched, the mate bond flared to life, not the painful, half-formed thing from 5 years ago, but complete, blazing, undeniable. Silver and gold light intertwined, spiraling up from their joined hands, visible to every witness. Rowan stood, but he didn't pull Alara close. He turned them both to face the assembled wolves, keeping her hand in his, presenting them as equals. Hear me, Rowan commanded, his voice carrying the alpha authority that made every wolf straighten instinctively. This woman is Alara Thorne, last daughter of the Thorne bloodline, Sanctuary Omega, Cursebreaker, and, from this moment forward, Queen of the Northern Territories. He looked at Silas, still in chains, his face twisted with impotent rage. Alpha Silas Miller, you stand accused of conspiracy to commit regicide, murder of the Thorne Alphas, systematic poisoning of a minor, and crimes against your own pack. Rowan's voice dropped to something deadly. You will live long enough to confess every detail to the High Council, and then you will spend the rest of your miserable existence in the deepest dungeon of Blackstone Prison, where the walls remember the screams of traitors. Silas spat at the ground, defiant even in defeat. She's nothing. An Omega playing dress-up in power she doesn't understand. Kneel, Alara said quietly. It was a single word, but it carried the weight of her newly awakened power. The silver light around her flared, and Silas's knees buckled. He crashed into the snow, his chains rattling, unable to resist the command from a sanctuary bloodline. Alara looked at the assembled Iron Ridge survivors, the ones who'd laughed when Gareth rejected her, who'd kicked her bucket and tripped her in hallways, who'd made every day of her life a calculated cruelty. All of you, she said, her voice growing stronger. Every wolf who tormented me. Every wolf who called me defective, who treated me as less than nothing. Kneel. Like dominoes falling, they dropped. The betas who'd sneered at her. The gammas who'd pretended she didn't exist. The omegas who'd been too afraid to befriend her. Even Tiffany, her expensive dress soaking in the bloody snow, her face a mask of humiliation. Only the Obsidian Guard remained standing, and then, in a gesture that made Alara's breath catch, Rowan's commander stepped forward and dropped to one knee. My queen, he said simply. One by one, The Obsidian Guard followed, 50 of the most elite warriors on the continent, kneeling not in defeat but in recognition. Rowan squeezed Alara's hand gently. "They kneel not because I command it," he said softly, "for her ears alone. They kneel because they see what I saw in that clearing 5 years ago. Strength that has nothing to do with claws or fangs. The kind of strength that saves a dying enemy and makes him a king worth following." Alara looked at the sea of bowed heads, at the pack that had tried to break her now prostrate in the snow, and felt the last piece of her old identity crumble away. She wasn't the broken Omega who scrubbed floors. She wasn't the rejected mate who'd fled into the woods to die. She was Alara Thorne, Queen of the Northern Territories, and she'd earned that title through every moment of suffering, every act of compassion, every choice to remain kind when cruelty would have been easier. "Rise," she commanded, her voice steady and clear. The Obsidian Guard stood immediately. The Iron Ridge survivors remained kneeling, uncertain. "I said rise," Alara repeated. "All of you." They stood slowly, confusion evident on their faces. They'd expected execution. Expected vengeance. "You will stand trial," Alara announced. "Those complicit in the conspiracy will answer for their crimes. But those who were merely cruel—" She paused, letting her silver eyes sweep across them. "You will live with the knowledge that the Omega you tried to break is now your queen. That every time you bow to the woman you underestimated. Consider that your punishment." She turned to Rowan, and in that moment, with the whole world watching, she made her choice. "I accept the mate bond," Alara said clearly. "Not because you claimed me, but because I choose you. I choose us. On my terms. As equals." Rowan's smile was brilliant, transforming his fierce face into something softer, more human. "On your terms," he agreed. "Always on your terms." And then, before the assembled wolves, before the defeated pack and the victorious guard, before the falling snow and the rising dawn, the King of Alphas and the Sanctuary Omega sealed their bond with a kiss that lit the clearing in silver and gold. When they finally pulled apart, Alara felt it, deep in her chest, beneath the newly completed mate bond. Her wolf, dormant for so long, stirred. Not erupting this time, but waking slowly, stretching like a cat in sunbeam. She was silver, as Rowan had predicted. Magnificent. Ancient. Powerful. And finally, after 20 years of suppression, she was free. Alara looked at Rowan, at the man who'd left her and come back, who'd made mistakes and knelt to make them right, and she smiled. "Take me home," she said. "Not to the palace. Not to the throne room. Just home, wherever that would be, as long as they walked there together, as equals, as partners, as mates who'd chosen each other despite everything that tried to keep them apart." Rowan swept her into his arms, and as the convoy prepared to depart, as Silas and Gareth were loaded into prison transports, as the Iron Ridge pack watched their world transform, Alara Thorne, once rejected, once broken, now queen, allowed herself to believe in new beginnings. The Omega who'd been angry at the dying wolf had become the queen who saved the king. And every alpha who'd ever doubted her would spend the rest of their lives kneeling in her shadow.